Their leader, Lancelot, had never been bested in battle. He had a lance as lethal as it was legend. But he also had the only key.
It's not every day that you come across a game that juxtaposes a whimsical storybook art style full of forest animals with a brutal weapon-based combat system. It's also equally uncommon for such ideas to blend together in a seamless way that doesn't feel forced or inorganic. Tales of Iron strives to be a game that accomplishes all of this, with its light emphasis on RPG mechanics and a rather bleak, somber overall tone. While it does seem to check a lot of the boxes that a game like this should, I still never quite felt all of its pieces click into place in a consistently satisfying way. Tales of Iron starts off at the peak of a long-fought rivalry between two kingdoms, the frogs and the rats. After a sustained period of tranquility, the Rat Kingdom once again finds itself in peril as the aging king can no longer protect it. Of course, the heir to the throne is his son, who you control throughout the treacherous journey of rescuing and re-establishing the Rat Kingdom to its former glory. This won't come easy though, as legions of warty frogs revel at the chance to stand in your way. The story is about as cookie-cutter as it gets for RPGs, and you shouldn't go into it expecting any interesting twists, outside of the archetypal characters that you normally see in games like this replaced with rats and frogs. It does set itself up well, despite unabashedly refusing to deviate from the formula in almost any meaningful way. How much its predictability might bother you will largely depend on how much the minutiae of the story of a game like this matters to you. To its credit, you do get a pretty good sense of the tone of the game from its highly detailed world. Everywhere you look, there's a visual feast. Ruins and macabre pepper every area, and the nice variety of color palettes and multitude of scrolling layers go a long way to establishing the vibe, even if the story itself doesn't. Tales of Iron's gameplay is a similarly mixed bag. It checks a lot of the side-scrolling action RPG boxes well enough, with a wide variety of weapons and shields that make you balance out their effectiveness with their weight, a handful of enemy types that require different approaches to take down, and the occasional bit of backtracking and side quests that can sometimes make the game feel like something bigger than it actually is. Depending on what you're looking for from this sort of game, it could be right up your alley if you don't want to deal with the complexities of truly deep combat, or be overwhelmed with the open-ended nature of a really expansive world. After all, there's nothing wrong with a simplistic take on a genre that normally sees more complex games come out of it. And to its credit, there is a bit more meat on the bone than first meets the eye, with food recipes that can be learned and a fair amount of weapons and armor that can be collected. But Tales of Iron's primary problem is not its watered-down nature, it's that it doesn't make any of its main mechanics fun or satisfying enough to weather the storm of monotony that inevitably rolls in once you notice its small handful of ideas starting to repeat themselves. The combat of Tales of Iron is presented as the main course, and does have a few functional, albeit boilerplate ideas that keep it from falling into complete mediocrity. Sneaking a few hits in between using your shield to block, dodging when red indicators are shown, and parrying when yellow indicators are shown is a delicate dance that can be fun when it's all happening at once and you're in the zone. Certain enemies might hang back and fire arrows at you while you're dealing with others in close quarters. And depending on the situation, you could justify going after either one first. When bigger enemies come in, however, they tend to have more distinct patterns that, in turn, force you to fight them in very specific ways that rarely allow for much experimentation. You'll learn this quickly, as fighting more than a few basic enemies at a time in the wrong way can quickly result in a chain reaction of getting bashed by all of them and killed before you even know what hit you. Parrying requires 2 button presses, both of which are triggers, so it can feel a bit mushy and imprecise to pull off, which doesn't mix well with the short windows of time you're often given between seeing that yellow indicator and getting hit. Dodging works well enough, but it won't work with enemies that are expecting a parry, only the red highlighted enemies that require a dodge. Not only does it not work with the yellow, but it will likely result in getting a hit by default. So when you're pulling it all together, it can feel a little bit more like a squishy rhythm game than a combat system. Finishing moves are there, but at their best, are only mildly amusing. Had the combat itself been more versatile and satisfying, replaying the same fights multiple times to find the right way to beat them could have been an interesting hook, but here, repeat attempts get stale long before they should. Thankfully, it doesn't rub any salt in the wound with sparse checkpoints or some sort of cumulative punishment for dying. But aside from that, with most attacks feeling stilted and unenthusiastic due to the rigid nature of the character models, the moment-to-moment combat in Tales of Iron often feels like a series of generic ideas held together by its presentation and mostly mediocre execution. I'll stop far short of calling it bad because it's not, but I'm equally uncomfortable with calling it particularly good. Thankfully, the game's many combat sections are broken up by some platforming and dialogue moments in a way that feels well-paced. You'll find yourself climbing up walls, wall jumping, even climbing across some ceilings. Traversal feels good enough, but much like the combat, nothing particularly interesting is ever really done with it to add to the overall experience or make those ideas feel organic to this game. The dialogues with other characters do their job at conveying certain ideas in a cute way by using animated pictures instead of words to convey certain concepts. It's a great idea, but the lack of text and voice also severely limits these characters' chances of ever being identified with or standing apart from each other. There's no real way for any of them to express unique personality traits with such a rudimentary style of communication. Perhaps the developer felt like the personality brought to the overall game from having this style of dialogue outweighs the loss of personality that each character suffers from it, but I'm not so sure it does. It ultimately just feels like they traded away an opportunity to get me to care about the characters, and thus the story, more. It also doesn't help that the noises used to represent characters' vocalizations are usually more annoying than not, especially after hearing them for the 7th or 8th time within just a couple of minutes. All things considered, I was surprised to see Tales of Iron playing it so safe in so many ways given the intriguing first impression it made with me. Ear-splitting dialogue sound effects aside, the music and sound is actually an area where the game shines quite a bit overall. The music always seems to fit the situation well, with thundering cellos during important battles and buoyant mandolins accompanying calmer sections. It all creates a perfect auditory foundation on which the visuals easily stand. In fact, the blend of sight and sound here is so good that had the game leaned into it a bit more, it could have really gone a long way to saving the experience from the doldrums of its gameplay. Tales of Iron never quite falls flat on its face. It's a functional and serviceable addition to its genre that gives players a well-realized world to experience and can provide some meaningful challenge, all while running respectably well. But with its somewhat wooden combat being the centerpiece, garnished with generic platforming and small handful of other slip-ups, it can sometimes be too much for its glimmers of inventiveness to overcome. The game's friendly price and obvious triumphs in art style and music might be enough for some to see it through. But as far as side-scrolling action RPGs go, there's just too many other ones that do much better what Tales of Iron is aiming at for me to recommend it broadly.
The captain was right. The frogs were inside. The villagers, they had no more fighters. Until now.
You can certainly tell that there's a lot of heart behind the game's general concept, and I'm always down for a dark, rodent-themed adventure, but the fact that almost none of the game's ideas ever reach any notable heights creates an unfortunately low ceiling for the overall experience. And that brings us to the end of the video. A quick request, we upload new videos every single day, and if you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing. It really helps us out. Also, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon so that you can receive daily video updates. Thanks for watching.